For more than a decade, millions of viewers believed they were watching something unbreakable, a man who never slowed down, a veterinarian who seemed immune to exhaustion, danger, and even time itself. Dr. Jan Pol wasn't just a television personality. He was a symbol of endurance. But behind the steady hands and familiar smile, something was quietly building toward a moment no one saw coming. And when that moment finally arrived, it didn't just change a show. It changed everything. The man before the myth. Long before television cameras followed him through muddy barns and emergency calls in the dead of night, Jan Pol was simply a farm boy shaped by scarcity, responsibility, and animals that depended on human care to survive. He was born on September 4, 1942, in the small village of Wateren in Drenthe, in the Netherlands, a country still recovering from the devastation of World War II. Food was limited, resources were scarce, and survival demanded discipline. Jan was the youngest of 6 children, growing up on a dairy farm where work was not optional and childhood ended early. Life on the farm was relentless. Cows needed milking every morning and evening. Animals fell ill without warning. Births and deaths were part of daily life, not rare events. While other children might have recoiled from the grit and physical demands, Jan leaned into it. He watched closely. He learned through observation. And he developed a quiet understanding of animal behavior that no textbook could teach. The farm wasn't just his home. It was his classroom. At the age of 12, a defining moment arrived. A sow went into labor, and the local veterinarian allowed Jan to assist in delivering the piglets. It wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was real, physical work, blood, urgency, responsibility. For the first time, Jan saw what it meant to intervene at the edge between life and death. That moment didn't frighten him. It focused him. From that day forward, becoming a veterinarian was no longer a dream. It was a decision. His path forward was not easy. Post-war Netherlands did not offer privilege or shortcuts. Jan studied relentlessly, earning his way into Utrecht University, one of Europe's most demanding veterinary programs. Veterinary medicine at Utrecht was unforgiving. Heavy on anatomy, pathology, surgery, and long hours inside teaching hospitals. Students were pushed to think practically, to make decisions with limited resources, and to accept that perfection was rarely possible. Jan thrived in that environment. He didn't chase prestige or urban careers. His mindset remained rooted in rural life, where animals were livelihoods, not luxuries. In 1961, during a high school exchange program, Jan spent a year in Michigan. That year would quietly redirect the course of his life. It was there he met Diane Dalrymple, an American student whose calm strength and practicality mirrored his own. When Jan returned to the Netherlands to complete his studies, the connection endured. In 1970, after earning his veterinary degree, Jan made a choice that few around him expected. He would leave his homeland and move to the United States. By 1971, Jan and Diane settled in Michigan, far from comfort or certainty. Jan entered rural veterinary practice, serving large farm animals, working long days across vast distances. The work was physically punishing. Emergency calls came at all hours. Winters were brutal, but it was familiar. It felt honest. And over the next decade, Jan built a reputation not through advertising or accolades, but through reliability. If he was called, he came. If an animal needed help, he didn't hesitate. In 1981, Jan and Diane took another risk. They moved to Weidman, Michigan, and founded Pol Veterinary Services, starting with a single room built into their garage. Interest rates hovered near 20%. Failure was a real possibility, but the clinic grew because trust grew. Farmers told one another that this veterinarian didn't overpromise. He didn't overcharge. He worked until the job was done. When real life met the camera. By the time television entered Dr. Jan Pol's world, He had already been practicing veterinary medicine for nearly 4 decades. He wasn't looking for fame, and he wasn't interested in changing how he worked. That was precisely why the idea appealed to television producers. What they saw wasn't polish or spectacle, it was authenticity. And authenticity, in an era saturated with manufactured reality, was rare. The turning point came through Charles Pohl, Jan's son, who had chosen a career in entertainment rather than veterinary medicine. While working in television, Charles realized something most outsiders had overlooked. His father's daily routine was already dramatic, unpredictable, and emotionally charged. There was no need to invent conflict. Life on a rural veterinary circuit provided it naturally. In 2010, Charles returned to Michigan with a small crew and filmed a single week of his father's work. They captured births, emergencies, exhaustion, humor, frustration, the unfiltered reality of a country veterinarian's life. From roughly 27 hours of footage, they created a short pitch. National Geographic Wild recognized immediately what made it compelling. This wasn't a performance. Jan Pohl didn't wait for cameras. He didn't repeat actions. He didn't slow down for explanations. The crew had to chase him, often tracking his movements through GPS just to keep up. When the incredible Dr. Pohl premiered, audiences responded not because the cases were shocking, but because the man at the center felt real. The show quickly became one of the network's strongest performers. Viewers connected with Jan's blunt honesty, his refusal to dramatize outcomes, and his belief that veterinary medicine was about service, not perfection. He didn't promise miracles, he promised effort. That approach resonated deeply, especially with rural families who saw their own lives reflected in his work. But the cameras changed more than visibility. They changed scale. Filming required roughly 100 hours of footage per episode cycle, spread across 8 months each year. That meant Jan Pohl was no longer just responding to emergencies. He was doing so under constant observation. The clinic didn't slow down. Farm calls didn't pause. Instead, pressure stacked quietly on top of an already punishing workload. Behind the scenes, production crews faced conditions they weren't trained for. Large animals don't behave for cameras. They panic, they kick, they break free. And while viewers saw controlled outcomes, crew members lived with daily near misses, calves slipping restraints, cattle charging unexpectedly, animals reacting violently under stress. Jan Pohl treated these risks as normal. He always had. But for the people around him, normal didn't mean safe. The day. Everything shifted. By the time the incredible Dr. Pohl reached its peak, the rhythm of Dr. Jan Pohl's life had become punishingly unsustainable. Filming schedules overlapped with real emergencies. Long farm calls bled into production days. And the man at the center of it all was no longer in his prime. He was in his late 70s, still working the way he had in his 40s, lifting heavy animals, kneeling in frozen barns, reacting instantly to unpredictable situations. Behind the scenes, danger had become routine. Crew members later admitted that nearly every shoot carried risk. Cattle were rarely fully restrained. Calves slipped free and bolted. Bulls thrashed against posts. Alpacas kicked without warning. On one occasion, a 300-pound calf broke loose and ran directly beneath a crew member, flipping them onto their back. In another incident, a massive bull snapped a barn post in half during castration. These moments were never aired. They were considered part of the job. The most serious incident occurred during what was supposed to be a routine shoot involving beef cattle. The environment was tense, animals agitated, space limited, cameras rolling. A cow that was not fully secured suddenly broke free and charged. One of the crew members was knocked down hard, struck with full force. The impact was severe enough to alarm everyone present. What made the situation worse was that the footage was lost. There was no dramatic replay, no warning to viewers. Only people on set knew how close it had come to catastrophe. That moment changed the atmosphere permanently. For the first time, the risks could no longer be minimized as part of rural life. Network executives began asking questions they had avoided for years. How many close calls had there been? How many injuries hadn't been documented? What would happen if the next impact was worse? If it involved the veterinarian himself? Dr. Pohl, true to form, didn't treat the incident as a turning point. He continued working. He enforced safety rules where he could. But age was no longer on his side. Reaction times slowed. Balance wasn't what it used to be. The work that once felt instinctive now carried consequences that couldn't be brushed aside. Pressure, loss, and a body that could not keep up. As the safety concerns intensified, another weight was pressing down on Dr. Jan Pohl, one far heavier than cameras or insurance reviews. His personal life was unraveling in ways no professional training could prepare him for. In February 2016, his family was shaken by the death of his son-in-law, Gregory Scott Butch, after a long battle with cancer. Gregory was not just family by marriage. He was deeply woven into the Pohl household. His loss left a silence that work could not fill. Then, in September 2019, tragedy struck again, this time with devastating finality. Dr. Pohl's grandson, Adam James Butch, died suddenly at just 23 years old. The loss was abrupt, shocking, and impossible to rationalize. For a man who had spent a lifetime saving lives, the helplessness of that moment cut deeper than anything he had known. Those close to him noticed a change. He still showed up. He still worked. But the ease, the lightness viewers once recognized, was gone. At the same time, his body was failing him. Decades of kneeling in barns, lifting animals heavier than himself, and enduring Michigan winters had taken their toll. Chronic pain became constant. His gait slowed. Tasks he once performed without thought now required assistance. Staff members increasingly stepped in, not out of protocol, but necessity. Yet Dr. Pohl resisted stepping back. Veterinary medicine was not just his profession, it was his identity. Slowing down felt like surrender. Even as filming grew more demanding and recovery from physical strain took longer, he insisted on being present. But the limits were undeniable. Production schedules had to adapt around his pace. The clinic redistributed responsibilities. The unstoppable figure audiences had known was now visibly human. Criticism from within the veterinary profession added another layer of strain. Lawsuits, probationary rulings, and appeals played out publicly, questioning methods he had relied on for decades. Some decisions were overturned, others upheld, but the emotional damage remained. Every challenge seemed to converge at once: grief, aging, scrutiny, and exhaustion. By the early 2020s, it was clear that something fundamental had shifted. The show was still running, the clinic was still operating, but the man holding everything together was carrying more than he ever had before. And for the first time, it was more than he could outrun. The decision no one wanted to make. By the early 2020s, the question surrounding the incredible Dr. Pohl was no longer about ratings or popularity. The show was still one of National Geographic Wild's most recognizable programs. It had passed major milestones, built a loyal audience, and become deeply embedded in the network's identity. The question was simpler and far more uncomfortable. Could it safely continue? Internally, the answer was becoming harder to avoid. Safety reviews had piled up. Incident reports told a story viewers never saw. Crew members knocked down by cattle, animals breaking restraints, emergency situations unfolding faster than cameras could react. Insurance costs rose. Liability concerns intensified. The environment that once felt manageable now looked increasingly unstable, especially with an aging lead whose work could not be separated from physical risk. At the same time, criticism from within the veterinary profession had reached a sustained level. Multiple complaints, disciplinary rulings, and appeals kept the show under constant scrutiny. Some sanctions were overturned due to gaps in Michigan's veterinary regulations. Others were upheld. But regardless of legal outcomes, the reputational toll was real. For a network built on educational credibility, the tension became impossible to ignore. Dr. Pohl himself did not push for an ending. He never announced retirement. He never stepped away publicly. Even as his role at Pohl Veterinary Services became more limited, he continued to consult, to appear, to insist on being involved. But the reality was clear to those closest to him. He could no longer physically sustain the pace that made the show what it was. And without that pace, the premise itself began to fracture. Behind closed doors, National Geographic Wild weighed every factor: safety, liability, ethics, sustainability. There was no single event to point to publicly, no dramatic statement, just a quiet conclusion that the risks now outweighed what the show could responsibly deliver. In early 2024, the decision was made to bring the series to an end after more than 2 decades of episodes. What remains after the cameras stopped? When the incredible Dr. Pohl finally ended, there was no single moment of collapse, no public scandal, no dramatic goodbye speech that explained everything. Instead, what remained was something quieter and far more sobering. A man in his 80s, standing at the edge of a life spent almost entirely in service, forced at last to slow down. At 83, Dr. Jan Pohl is no longer the unstoppable figure viewers first met. His role at Pohl Veterinary Services has shifted. Younger veterinarians now carry the physical burden of farm calls and emergencies. Dr. Pohl consults, advises, and remains present when he can. But the days of charging into barns at all hours are behind him. The clinic he built from a single room in his garage still stands, but its future feels uncertain without the man who was always its heartbeat. What the show never fully captured was the cumulative cost. Decades of physical labor left his body worn and fragile. Years of public scrutiny questioned methods he once practiced without hesitation. And the personal losses, especially the death of his grandson Adam, reshaped him in ways no audience could fully see. For someone whose identity was built on saving lives, grief introduced a kind of helplessness he had never known. The accident that changed everything was not just the moment a crew member was injured, or the instant safety could no longer be ignored. It was the point where all the invisible pressures collided: age, risk, loss, liability, and exhaustion, and forced a reckoning. The cameras didn't stop because the story ran out. They stopped because the cost had become too high. Do you believe the incredible Dr. Pohl ended at the right moment, or should he have stepped away sooner for his own safety? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more untold stories behind the faces we think we know.